Hello, I'm Tom Kimmel. MK Cote, thank you again for that effusive, inflated, hyperbolic introduction that I provided for you. Stay with me, folks, and I promise you some facts you have never heard before, some free stuff, and hopefully some fun along the way. After all, it's my job to talk today, your job to listen. Should you finish before I do, then God bless you. The Pearl Harbor story boils down to this, folks. Almost everyone in Washington versus the Hawaiian Command, Kimmel and Short. The important exception is Captain Lawrence Safford, the head of Naval Communications Intelligence in Washington, D.C., who dared to tell the truth, and without whom there is no Pearl Harbor story as we know it today. Notwithstanding the preceding, the Pearl Harbor story today still boils down to Washington versus Kimmel and Short. This is the third of a six-part, six-class presentation that I am presenting on February, should be 15th, 2018. So it's time to get started. Pearl Harbor spying. It's a great subject. Folks, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly, but the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face in their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to fear. Okay, let's now hear from noted Pearl Harbor scholar John Blutarski.
Over? You say over? Nothing is over until we decide it is. Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? Hell no!
Your candidate's rolling.
It ain't over now. Because when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Who's with me? Let's go! Come on!
Inspiring words, to be sure. But did Blutarski actually say that the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? Well, let's find out. Let's find out the truth and analyze it. Consider this. 2 days before Admiral Kimmel took over as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, this secret dispatch from Japan arrived and was decoded a week later by U.S. intelligence in a program codenamed Magic. Japan's foreign minister ordered his ambassador in Washington to establish an intelligence organization in the embassy and to get the details from Secretary Terasaki upon his assuming his duties there. He then explained that Japan was cooperating with German intelligence in the United States that this had been discussed with the Germans in Tokyo and it had been approved. Japan's dispatch was decoded and translated 6 days after Admiral Kimmel took command of the Pacific. But this vital information was not sent to Kimmel. Not only did this dispatch reveal that German and Japanese intelligence were cooperating, but it identified the head of Japanese intelligence for the Western Hemisphere to include Hawaii. Nonetheless, it was not sent to Hawaii. And, unbelievably, the Joint Congressional Committee did not even include this message in its report, in spite of its importance. Here's a definition of magic. It's unavoidable if you want to know what really happened at Pearl Harbor. Magic was a code word for the secret American decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications. Magic provided indications prior to the Pearl Harbor attack of the time, place, reason, and deceit plan to cover the attack. Hawaii, of course, had no magic. But Washington, D.C., Manila in the Philippines, meaning General MacArthur, and the commander of the Asiatic Fleet, Admiral Hart, they had access to magic. And the British had magic because we gave it to them. Of course, what we know incontrovertibly is that Admiral Kimmel had no magic. We have come to learn that the director of the FBI didn't have any magic either, even though he was charged by the President of the United States as in charge of internal security for the United States. We also have learned that William Donovan, the man charged by the President of the United States as in charge of external security for the United States, he didn't have access to magic either. But we have come to learn that the Soviets, meaning Stalin, had access to magic. We'll cover that in a later presentation. Okay. On March 18th, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, German military intelligence officer, that's the Abwehr, Captain Ulrich von der Osten, was killed, probably assassinated in Times Square, New York. His partner, Ludwig, fled with Osteen's briefcase. In the briefcase, the FBI found, later in Osteen's apartment, a report that Osteen had prepared in Hawaii on the defenses at Pearl Harbor, with Osteen's written comment, cursive comment, that this will be of interest mostly to our yellow allies. Amazingly, this report was never sent to Hawaii. Popov's spy questionnaire. Popov was another spy sent by the Abwehr, but this time Popov was cooperating with British intelligence. British intelligence turned Popov over to the United States intelligence, specifically to the FBI. Popov had a very interesting questionnaire that the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had given him. And what they wanted to find out was whether torpedo nets were in use at Pearl Harbor. They also wanted to find out the depth of water at Pearl Harbor. Anyone seeing this questionnaire would certainly want to know why. The FBI actually sent paraphrased versions of the questionnaire to the Office of Naval Intelligence. But the Office of Naval Intelligence did not send this information to Hawaii. And of course, the vast majority of damage at Pearl Harbor was inflicted by airdrop torpedoes. This whole Popov matter was classified until 1983. Admiral Kimmel had no idea that any of this existed, nor, as a matter of fact, did any Pearl Harbor investigation. The FBI, the Navy, and the Army all kept this meticulously secret from all Pearl Harbor investigations. Here's the questionnaire, and that's Popov. And as you can see, They were seeking information about Naval Strong Point, Pearl Harbor. They wanted to know the depth of water there, and they wanted to know, as a special task, they wanted a report about torpedo neck protection. Let's pause at this point and take a moment to ask a very important question about this Pearl Harbor story.
So why have the last 4 presidents chosen not to reinstate the full ranks of Admiral Kimmel and General Short? Especially when in 2000, a U.S. Senate resolution exonerated both men.
I think the reason that modern American presidents have refused to see Kimmel reinstated to his original rank is because it's such a stain on American history. You risk reopening the case against the president at the time, FDR. So going back, looking at it again, is dangerous.
Dangerous? How so? Well, it might reveal the extent of Soviet espionage in President Roosevelt's administration. So better to keep the focus on Kimmel and away from Pearl Harbor-related Soviet espionage, actual or suspected, in the Roosevelt administration, especially by Harry Dexter White. There were many others as well, as revealed by Venona. More on Venona in a moment. The Army Pearl Harbor Board styled Secretary of State Cordell Hull's November 26, 1941 note to the Japanese as the document that touched the button that started the war. Obviously, the Army Pearl Harbor Board thought this was terribly important. So the question would be, naturally, prompted by this curiosity, who wrote it? Who wrote this document that touched the button that started the war? Well, in its first and second iterations, Soviet spy Harry Dexter White wrote it. This language, which effectively says, Japan, get out of China or else, was first written by Harry Dexter White in June of 1941. In November of 1941, he wrote for Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau and President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull the same language. The same language being, in effect, get out of China, Japan, or else. So if you follow that language and check it against Secretary of State Cordell Hull's actual note that he sent to Japan, the language is almost identical. In pertinent part here is what Hull's American note to Japan looked like after Secretary Hull received Harry Dexter White's second memo. All of this discarded the proposed modus vivendi, as it's called, which is a document that merely states that the two arguing parties, two arguing countries, won't do anything for 90 days. In other words, a cooling off period. That idea of a cooling off period was thrown overboard by Secretary of State Cordell Hull's November 26, 1941 note, as recommended by Soviet spy Harry Dexter White. Well, what was known about Harry Dexter White while the Joint Congressional Committee was in session in 1946? Well, in May of 1945, Soviet spy Whittaker Chambers told the FBI that Harry Dexter White was a Soviet spy. Chambers' initial 1939 warnings to the United States government were ignored. In November of 1945, another Soviet spy, Elizabeth Bentley, identified Harry Dexter White as a Soviet spy to the FBI. The FBI actually had a memo prepared to President Truman concerning spies to include Harry Dexter White. President Truman, however, in 1946, ignored FBI Director Hoover's warning not to appoint Soviet spy Harry Dexter White to head the International Monetary Fund. President Truman refused to believe Hoover's report that another Soviet spy was indeed a Soviet spy, Alger Hiss. Truman was worried that pursuit of Venona would be a liability to President Roosevelt's place in history, and was worried that pursuit of Venona would be politically damaging to the Democratic Party. So nothing was done with these warnings from the FBI. Mr. Hoover could speak with great confidence on Soviet espionage because he was privy to Venona, and I'll discuss Venona in just a moment. But first, J. Edgar Hoover.
Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America, just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States.
So what is Venona? Well, you definitely need to compare it to magic. Magic was the secret decoding of Japanese spy communications prior to the Pearl Harbor attack. Venona was the American code word for a program to break Soviet spy communications sent from the United States to Moscow from 1939 to 1948. There were about 2,900 cables that were actually broken. This only represented 10%. The program started in 1943, was actually compromised by another Soviet spy working in the American government. The program ended in the United States in 1980. The program identified 349 American spies, but only about half of them were identified by true name. The other half were only identified by their cover names, their secret code names, their cover names. The program was not even declassified until 1995. Admiral Kimmel had no idea that such a thing existed. Interestingly enough, in the words of a National Security Agency Venona expert lecturing in 2011, Robert Benson had this to say: Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. was surrounded by spies. When he walked into his office Monday morning, he would not have seen anyone who was not a Soviet spy. Here's an actual Venona cable. You notice the code word, this is bride. That was the code word before Venona. They changed the code words from time to time to try and enhance security in the program. But here's Harry Dexter White, mentioned by his code name in this Soviet communication. His code name was Richard. And these are Soviet spies: Elizabeth Bentley, Whittaker Chambers, and Alger Hiss. Bentley and Chambers, recall, had identified Harry Dexter White for the FBI as a Soviet spy because Harry Dexter White actually worked for Bentley and for Chambers. So they were certainly knowledgeable about what they were reporting on. if measured by results, folks, Harry Dexter White was at the center of possibly the greatest espionage operation of all time, if you measure that by results. Operation Snow was the code name for the Soviet operation. It came from Harry Dexter White. White is in snow, snow is in white. And here was the gist of it. Soviet spy Harry Dexter White, at the direction of KGB officers Akhmerov and Pavlov, wrote a hard-edged memo to Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, which was then largely incorporated into Secretary of State Cordell Hull's famous ultimatum to the Japanese. Here's what the Russians themselves said about Operation Snow in a trade magazine in 2002. Harry Dexter White was acting in accordance with a design initiated by Akhmerov and Pavlov. The essence of Operation Snow was to provoke the war between Japan and the United States to ensure the security of the Soviet Union. Operation Snow. In May of 1941, KGB officer Vitaly Pavlov met with Harry Dexter White in Washington, D.C. He was selected to do so by Ishak Akhmerov, a legendary illegals officer operating in the United States all through the 1930s, with remarkable success in corrupting Americans to work for the Soviets. The purpose of Operation Snow was to present a series of policy initiatives which involved Soviet efforts to worsen U.S.-Japanese relations. Acting on Pavlov's initiative, Harry Dexter White wrote proposals against Japan which President Roosevelt implemented. Japan abandoned its plans accordingly against the Soviet Union and looked to the south instead. In other words, to the United States, to the British and the Dutch. Due to Soviet influence, the United States set up a foreign policy that placed the Kremlin's interests ahead of the United States. So what was the magnitude of Soviet espionage, of the Soviet espionage problem in the United States? Well, consider this. These 11 spies are just in the Treasury Department. Venona identified these spies, who were later confirmed through a host of other techniques. You'll notice that identified by Whittaker Chambers in 1939 was the Assistant Secretary of State, identified to the Assistant Secretary of State, was Harry Dexter White, down there, number 11. It wasn't just the Treasury Department that had this problem identified by Venona. In the State Department, we have some 22 Soviet spies identified by their true name. And this spy, number 2 here, Lauchlin Curie, was actually a special assistant directly to the president, to President Roosevelt. Here was an interview with Lauchlin Curie before he fled to South America to avoid prosecution for his espionage.
Good evening, I'm Hugh Downs.
And I'm Barbara Walters, and this is 2020. It's a Pearl Harbor anniversary story you probably won't see anywhere else. The intriguing possibility that in launching a sneak attack, Japan did to us what we might well have done to them. Tonight you'll hear the details of a secret plan approved at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
This plan was signed and approved by FDR himself on July 23rd, 1941, nearly 5 months before Pearl Harbor.
I certainly didn't know that there were plans for strategic bombing of Japan before Pearl Harbor.
No one knew about the bombing plans.
That was secret. All the supplies were secret. I mean, what we were sending is not a matter of public knowledge.
No question about it.
And your mission was to take them on?
Yes, yes. Certainly, order of priority was one, seize control of the air over China. Keep
China in the war.
When you were recruiting men for the American Volunteer Group that summer, 1941, what was the strategic goal of the operation?
Well, to kill as many damn Japanese as we could. That's simple.
U.S. government knew about this. Helped develop this plan.
Not only knew about it, but they were 100% behind it. Where do you think the $50 million came from? The United States. It was secret. Nobody was supposed to talk about it. We did a damn good job of keeping it secret.
Claire Chennault wanted to bomb Japan, didn't he?
Yes, very much so.
You were an enthusiastic supporter of Chennault's plan.
Oh, yes. And I helped in every way I could, yes.
To push the plan through, to see that it was executed.
Oh, yeah, the whole project,
yes. Number 23 here. Venona identified spies in the military and war production. Number 23 was William Wiseman, who actually compromised the Venona program to the Soviets. Let's end this Venona discussion with a tremendous whack. As we discussed before, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. So, folks, I ask you, what has changed today? Anybody? Well, the answer is nothing. Let's stop there, and I'll take whatever questions you might have. Okay, let's go.